The first thing Officer Vance Harlow did when he walked into Dot's Corner Bakery that morning was smile. Not the kind of smile that means anything good. The kind that means he already knew how this was going to end. He picked up the complaint form from his clipboard, slowly, deliberately, and slapped it down on Dorothy Ellison's counter, so hard the ceramic sugar dish rattled off the edge and shattered on the floor. A little girl sitting by the window flinched. Her mother pulled her close. Harlow leaned forward close enough that Dorothy could smell the coffee on his breath. "Old women like you," he said, voice low, almost gentle. "Old black women who think they built something in this town. They need to be reminded of their place." Dorothy set down her mixing spoon slowly, deliberately, the way a person sets something down when they want their hands free. "My place," she said quietly, "is right here, has been for many years, and I'm not going anywhere." Harlow's smile didn't waver. He turned to Officer Malcolm Reed and nodded once. Reed moved to the display case, the one Dorothy had built herself, the one that held dozens of peach hand pies she'd been up since before dawn making, and knocked it with his elbow. The entire tray crashed to the floor. Pastry and broken ceramic scattered across the tile. Harlow looked down at the mess, then back up at Dorothy, tilting his head like he was genuinely puzzled. "Shame," he said. "Looked like it took a while to make. Guess some people just aren't cut out for this business." "I served this country for many years," Dorothy said, her voice steady, each word measured and clean. "I have buried friends. I have held dying men in my hands. You think a broken tray is going to move me?" Something flickered behind Harlow's eyes. Not respect. Something closer to irritation. The irritation of a man who expected fear and got something else entirely. He walked to the wall where her framed business license hung. The original one she'd received years ago. The one she'd had laminated and pulled it off the hook. The frame hit the floor. Glass scattered across the tile. He didn't look at it. He looked at her. "Don't worry," he said, folding the license and slipping it into his breast pocket. "Where this is going, you won't be needing it." Dorothy did not move. She stood in the middle of her own kitchen, flour on her shoulders, glass at her feet, many years of her life being folded into a stranger's pocket. And she looked at Vance Harlow, the way a woman looks at something she has already decided she will outlast. "You think you're the first person who tried to take something from me?" she said softly. "You are not." What Vance Harlow did not know, what none of them knew, was that 2 blocks away at Millhaven City Hall, a ceremony was about to begin. And the woman chosen to hold the Bible for that ceremony was standing right here, covered in flour, surrounded by broken glass, watching him smile. Don't go anywhere. This story is just getting started. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if stories like this stay with you, hit subscribe. Because the next chapter, you're going to want to see how it ends. The radio on Dorothy Ellison's kitchen shelf had been playing the same jazz station for many years. She hadn't changed it once. Not when the signal got fuzzy in winter. Not when her daughter offered to buy her a Bluetooth speaker for Christmas several years running. Not when the morning DJ retired and was replaced by someone younger, who talked too much between songs. The music stayed. The station stayed. Some things Dorothy believed you do not fix if they are not broken. She had opened Dot's Corner Bakery many years ago, after she hung up her army uniform for the last time. The building had been a hardware store before that, then a laundromat, then nothing. Just a vacant space on the corner with a cracked front window and a sun-bleached for lease sign. Dorothy had seen it and thought, yes. She couldn't have explained why. She just knew. Many years later, the cracked window was long replaced. The walls were painted a warm amber that her late mother had called the color of late afternoon. Glass cases along the front held whatever she had made that morning. Peach hand pies on some days, cornbread loaves on others, sweet potato pound cake on others, which was the reason the line sometimes stretched half a block. A chalkboard menu above the register changed regularly. Photographs lined the wall beside the door. Dorothy in uniform, young and straight-backed, somewhere in the Saudi desert in the early 90s. Dorothy and her unit, arms around each other in the way people hold each other when they know they might not all make it home. Dorothy receiving the Army Commendation Medal, her expression serious because she understood what it cost, and in the center of them all, framed in dark wood, a photograph of a woman named Eleanor Price, Dorothy's closest friend, killed in a vehicle accident outside Dhahran, smiling at the camera like she had no idea what was coming. Dorothy had enlisted because of Eleanor, had stayed many years because of the work, had come home because Millhaven was where she was from, and she had decided at middle age that she was done going where she was sent and ready to go where she chose. She was in her late 60s now. Her hands still moved with the precision of someone trained to work under pressure. She could frost a 3-layer cake in minutes. She could, as she sometimes told her daughter, still read a wound and know whether it needed stitches or surgery. The body remembers what it learned long after the mind thinks it has moved on. That morning had started the way most mornings started. She was at the bakery early, coffee brewing, first batch in the oven. She had proofed the dough the night before, a habit never skipped. By the time the shop opened, it smelled the way it always smelled: warm sugar, cinnamon, browning butter. The particular comfort of something made from scratch by someone who knew what they were doing. Her first customers arrived when she unlocked the door. Old Mr. Pearson, who came every week for a corn muffin and stayed a long while. The Newland sisters, who split a peach pie between them and argued warmly about everything. A young man she didn't know who ordered a coffee and sat in the corner with his laptop and headphones. By mid-morning, the rush had settled into that comfortable middle hour when the shop was neither empty nor full, just alive quietly the way she liked it. She was behind the counter when the bell above the door rang. She did not look up immediately. She was crimping the edge of a pie crust, a motion her hands could do without her eyes, and she finished the motion before she raised her head. Vance Harlow stood in the doorway. She had seen him before. Everyone on Oak Street had seen him before. Tall, thick through the shoulders, with close-cut brown hair going gray at the temples and small pale eyes that never quite settled on anything. They moved constantly, cataloging, assessing, looking for angles. He had been on the Millhaven force for many years. He had a reputation, the way some men have a smell. You noticed it before you could name it. Behind him came Officer Malcolm Reed, younger, softer around the edges, with the particular expression of a man who has told himself enough times that he is just doing his job that he has almost started to believe it. And behind Reed, Officer Bryce Harlan, who Dorothy had never seen smile at anything except other officers' jokes. "Mrs. Ellison," Harlow said in the tone of a man who has decided to be pleasant for exactly as long as it is useful. "Hope we're not interrupting." "You are," Dorothy said, "but go ahead." Something moved behind his eyes. He walked to the counter, unhurried, and set down a clipboard with a form attached. A health department complaint filed the previous evening. Dorothy read the header upside down without leaning in. She had spent many years learning to read things she was not supposed to be reading. "Noise and odor violations," Harlow said. "Neighbor complaints, smoke from your ovens apparently, and the ventilation system." Dorothy looked up from the form. "My ventilation system was inspected recently, passed without a single citation." "Things change," Harlow said. The little girl by the window was watching. Her mother had stopped pretending to read her phone. Mr. Pearson had set down his muffin. Dorothy looked at Vance Harlow, across the counter of her bakery, in the middle of her morning, in the building she had made from nothing, and she said very calmly, "What is it you actually want, officer?" Harlow smiled. That was when she knew this was going to get worse before it got better. Inspector Walter Finch arrived soon after. Dorothy had known he was coming before he knocked. The timing was too precise, the paperwork too ready. Harlow had produced several separate violation forms from his clipboard within minutes of arriving, which meant they had been filled out before he walked through the door. You do not fill out violation forms for a business you have not yet inspected, which meant someone had decided before that morning that Dot's Corner Bakery was going to be in violation of something. The inspection was a formality. Finch was a prop. He was a thin man with rimless glasses and a clipboard of his own, and he moved through Dorothy's bakery the way certain people move through spaces that belong to others, with a performed authority, touching things he had no particular reason to touch, pausing at arbitrary intervals to write something down. He opened the oven door without asking. He pressed his palm flat against the prep table and examined it as though he expected to find something. He crouched beside the baseboards near the sink and stayed there long enough for everyone in the room to wonder what he was looking at, then stood up and wrote 3 lines. "Under-ventilation output exceeds municipal threshold," he said to Harlow, not to Dorothy. "Surface temperature inconsistency on the secondary prep station, and I'm seeing potential cross-contamination risk near them." "That is a clean kitchen," Dorothy said. Her voice did not rise. "I have run a clean kitchen for many years. My last inspection score was high. The threshold for closure is much lower." Finch looked at her over his glasses. "Regulations update, ma'am. Thresholds adjust." "Now show me the updated regulation code," Dorothy said. A pause. Finch looked at Harlow. Harlow looked at Dorothy and smiled. "The paperwork will be filed with your copy of the violations," Harlow said. "Standard procedure." There was no updated code. Dorothy knew it. Harlow knew she knew it. This was the point. Not the citations, not the inspection. The point was the audience. Mr. Pearson was still at his table, muffin untouched, now watching with the careful stillness of a man who has seen this kind of thing before and knows that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is move. The Nguyen sisters had gone quiet. The young man with the laptop had taken out one earbud and was staring at his screen, with the exaggerated attention of someone listening to everything around him. Officer Bryce Harlan moved to the display case. He did not ask permission. He lifted the edge of the tray, holding the peach hand pies, dozens of them, made from scratch with early morning dough, and tilted it almost thoughtfully, the way a child tests the edge of something before deciding to push it all the way. "Don't," Dorothy said. Harlan looked at Harlow. Harlow nodded barely, just a fraction of a chin drop. The tray went over. Dozens of peach hand pies hit the tile floor in a cascade of pastry and filling and breaking ceramic. The sound was enormous in the small space. The little girl by the window began to cry. Harlow turned to the child's mother with an expression of exaggerated concern. "Sorry about the mess, ma'am. Health hazard. We're going to need to ask everyone to clear the premises while we complete the inspection." The mother gathered her daughter and left without a word. Mr. Pearson stood, slowly put on his hat, and paused at the door. He looked at Dorothy. His expression said, "I'm sorry. I don't know how to help." Dorothy gave him the smallest nod. He left. Within minutes, the bakery was empty except for Dorothy, 3 officers, and Inspector Finch. Harlow walked to the wall beside the register. He looked at the photographs. The desert. The unit, Eleanor Price, smiling in her frame, with the polite disinterest of a man looking at wallpaper. Then he reached up and unhooked the framed business license from its nail. The frame swung, hit the wall, dropped. Glass broke across the floor. He did not pick it up. He unfolded the license from the frame, creased it once along the center, and slid it into his breast pocket. "We'll be holding this pending review," he said, "and I'm going to need you to close for the day. Post the notice on the door. We'll be in touch about next steps." Dorothy looked at him. Then she looked at Malcolm Reed, who was studying the floor with intense concentration, as though the tile pattern required his full attention. "Officer Reed," she said. Reed looked up. He couldn't help it. "You know this is wrong," she said. Not an accusation, a statement, clean and direct, offered to him like a question he still had time to answer correctly. Reed opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Harlow. Harlow was already moving toward the door, pulling a pre-printed closure notice from his clipboard. Because of course it had been pre-printed. Of course it had. And pressing it against the front glass with one hand, while he peeled the backing off the adhesive strip with his teeth. The notice went up. Red letters on white paper. Temporarily closed. Health violation. By order of Millhaven Health Authority. Outside on the sidewalk, 3 neighbors had stopped walking. A woman Dorothy recognized from the dry cleaner 2 blocks down. A man who brought his truck to the mechanic across the street. A teenager on a bicycle, 1 foot on the ground, watching. Dorothy walked to her door and stood in the frame of it, inside her own closed bakery, looking out. "I have stood in worse places than this," she said quietly to no one in particular. Or perhaps to Eleanor, whose photograph was still on the wall, where it had always been. "And I am still standing." She reached into the pocket of her apron and took out her phone. She dialed. It rang twice. "Mom." The voice on the other end was immediate, alert, the voice of someone who picks up because they have learned that when this particular person calls, it matters. "What's wrong?" The uniform had arrived recently, pressed and sealed in a dry cleaner's bag that Naomi Ellison had hung on the back of her bedroom door, and not touched since. Every morning she had looked at it while she made her bed. The deep navy of the fabric, the silver insignia on the collar, the badge pinned to the chest pocket by the tailor who had done the final fitting, catching whatever light came through the window. Chief of Police, Millhaven. The words were formal and final in the way that only certain things are: wedding vows, military commissions, the names on headstones. She had not let herself feel it yet. There would be time for that later. Right now there was still work. Chief Naomi Ellison was in her early 40s and had spent many of those years in law enforcement the way some people spend time in a vocation, not as a career but as a calling, the kind that finds you before you are fully ready for it and does not let go. She had started as a patrol officer in a nearby city, made detective, moved to the state police, to the criminal investigations division, to commander of a district. Every promotion had been earned in the specific way that promotions are earned when the system is not inclined to give them to you, through documentation, through results, through a record so clean and consistent that there was simply no argument left to make against it. She had applied for the Millhaven chief position months ago. She had applied because Millhaven was where she was from, because her mother was there alone, because she had read the department's complaint records going back many years and understood immediately, with the clarity of someone who knows what a pattern looks like, that something was deeply wrong. She had not told her mother she applied. Dorothy Ellison had a particular way of carrying pride that made it almost impossible to disappoint her. And Naomi had not wanted to create an expectation she might not be able to meet. She had told her the week she received the confirmation, over the phone on a Sunday evening. Dorothy had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "Well, I suppose I'll need to find someone else for Sunday dinners," which was her way of saying she was proud beyond words. That morning, Naomi had been sitting in the back of a black department SUV outside Millhaven City Hall, reviewing her remarks for the ceremony, when a reporter had knocked on the window. She had stepped out, shaken his hand, begun the interview in the careful way she had learned to speak to journalists, direct, precise, never more than you intend to give. "What's your first priority taking over the department?" the reporter had asked. "Accountability," she had said. "Transparent complaint processes. Every report filed, every report reviewed, every outcome documented and accessible to the public. No exceptions." The reporter had written that down. He had looked up to ask a follow-up question. Her phone had rung. She had seen the name on the screen and felt something shift in her chest. Not alarm, not yet, but the particular attention that a body gives to things that matter. She had held up one finger to the reporter, turned slightly and answered, "Mom, what's wrong?" Dorothy's voice was level. That was in some ways the most alarming thing about it. Her mother had a particular register of calm that she deployed in proportion to the severity of what she was managing. The worse the situation, the quieter and more deliberate the voice. Naomi had learned this as a child and had never forgotten it. The voice on the phone right now was very quiet and very deliberate. Dorothy told her what had happened. She did not exaggerate. She did not editorialize. She gave times where she had them, names where she had them, a description of each officer, a summary of each action. She was, Naomi thought, giving a report. Many years of military discipline did not disappear. You just applied it to whatever situation you were in. When Dorothy finished, Naomi said, "Don't move. Don't sign anything. Don't let anyone remove anything else from the premises." "I know," Dorothy said. "I'm coming." "I know that too." Naomi ended the call. She turned to the reporter, who had the practiced stillness of a journalist who knows when to stop asking questions and start watching. "I need to make one call," she said. "Then I need you to come with me." She dialed her department liaison and spoke briefly. She needed Harlow's full personnel file. Complaints, disciplinary records, financial disclosures. She needed the health department's inspection logs for the Oak Street corridor, going back many years. She needed it quickly. Then, she opened the SUV door and retrieved the uniform bag from the back seat. She had not planned to put it on until the ceremony. She put it on now, standing beside the vehicle on a public street, because she understood that what she was about to walk into was not separate from the ceremony. It was the first act of it. The reporter stood nearby, notepad in hand, saying nothing. His camera operator had appeared from somewhere and was already recording. Naomi buttoned the jacket, straightened the collar, looked down at the badge. Then she started walking toward Oak Street. Behind her, the reporter fell into step. "Chief," he said, the first time anyone had called her that. "Should I be recording this?" "Yes," she said without slowing down. "Make sure you get everything." Sergeant Harlan Reed's phone buzzed on his desk. He read the message without picking up the phone. Just tilted the screen toward him, read it, and set it face down. Then he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands behind his head the way a man does when he is satisfied with how the morning is going. The message was from Harlow. "Oak Street handled. Old woman won't be a problem." Reed had been with the Millhaven Police Department for many years. He had outlasted several chiefs, city managers, and inquiries that had come uncomfortably close before quietly dissolving. He had learned over those years that the most important skill in his profession was not marksmanship or interrogation or even paperwork. It was patience, the ability to wait out inconvenience. Problems in his experience resolved themselves if you gave them enough time and enough pressure. Dorothy Ellison was not the first business owner on Oak Street who had needed to understand how things worked in Millhaven. She would not be the last. But she would, like the others, eventually understand. He picked up his phone and deleted Harlow's message. Then he walked to the window of his office, which looked out over the parking lot, and felt the particular contentment of a man who believes he controls things he does not actually control. What Reed did not know was that Officer Lena Harper had been standing nearby when the message arrived. She had not been close enough to read the text, but she had been close enough to see his face when he read it. The small upward movement at the corners of his mouth, the deliberate stillness that followed. And she had been doing this job long enough to understand what that expression meant on that particular man's face. Harper was young and had been with the department for about a year. She had joined because she believed in something, which she now understood was either her greatest strength or her greatest liability, depending on the day. She had spent her time watching things she did not like and telling herself she was still learning, still finding her footing, still too new to know whether what she was seeing was as wrong as it felt. She was done telling herself that. She walked back to her desk, sat down and took a small notebook from her top drawer. Personal, not department issued. She wrote the time. She wrote Reed's name. She wrote, received message, read it, deleted it. Expression indicated satisfaction. Then she wrote everything she could remember from the previous hour. The call Harlow had made requesting Finch meet him at Oak Street. The pre-printed closure notices she had seen in Harlow's clipboard when he left the building. The way Thompson had been told specifically, and in those words, to be thorough. She wrote until her hand hurt. Then she looked at what she had written and made a decision. In the large conference room at the end of the hall, retiring Chief Victor Lang, was accepting a sheet cake with his own face printed on it in frosting. Someone had found a photograph from his early years on the force, young, dark-haired, considerably thinner, and had it transferred to blue and white buttercream. The room was full of people holding plastic cups of sparkling cider and saying the things people say at retirement parties. Many years, can you believe it, huh? What are you going to do with yourself? You earned it. You really earned it. Lang looked in this moment profoundly comfortable. He had built something in Millhaven. It was not the something he would have described in public, but it was a structure nonetheless. A careful arrangement of looking away at the right moments, of filing certain things and losing others, of knowing which complaints would be pursued and which would be closed quickly without explanation. It had required patience and consistency, and he had provided both. Now he was leaving, and the arrangement would continue because he had chosen his successors carefully, or so he believed. Back on Oak Street, the closure notice was drawing attention from further up the block. A woman named Beverly Okafor, who ran the hair salon 3 doors down, had come to stand outside her own shop and read the red letters on white paper. She had been on Oak Street for many years. She had her own memories of Harlow. Inside the closed bakery, Dorothy sat on the wooden stool she kept behind the counter, the one she'd had for many years, the one with the cracked leg she kept meaning to fix. She sat straight, hands in her lap, looking at the flour still dusting the floor around the fallen display tray. She was not looking at the floor the way a defeated person looks at a mess. She was looking at it the way a person looks at something they are going to clean up. Malcolm Reed stood near the side wall. He had not left with Harlow and Bryce Harlan, which was either conscience or cowardice. He was not entirely sure himself. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I want you to know that I don't," Dorothy said without looking at him. "I just meant—" "I know what you meant," she said. Now she looked at him. "Wanting to say something isn't the same as doing something, officer. I've known that distinction since before you were born." Reed closed his mouth. Harper's voice crackled through his radio, clipped and quiet. "Reed, don't touch anything. Don't let anyone remove anything from the premises. Senior command is en route." Reed looked at his radio, then at Dorothy. Dorothy had heard it too. Something moved across her face. Not surprise, not relief. Something more complicated than either of those. She looked at the photograph of Eleanor Price, still hanging straight on the wall above the broken glass. Outside at the far end of Oak Street, a black SUV turned the corner. The SUV stopped near the bakery door. Naomi stepped out, and the first thing she did was nothing. She stood beside the vehicle for a moment long enough to take in the full picture. The closure notice on the glass, the flour and broken ceramic visible through the window. Dorothy on her stool visible through the same window, sitting with the precise stillness of a woman who has been waiting. Harlow and Harlan near the door. Reed inside. Finch consulting his clipboard near the counter like a man performing business. She took all of it in. Then she walked forward. Beverly Okafor, standing outside the hair salon, recognized her first. Then the man from the auto shop across the street. A murmur moved through the small crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk. Not loud, just the particular sound of people recalibrating what they thought was about to happen. Harlow turned at the sound of footsteps. He looked at Naomi the way men like Harlow look at women in uniform, when they have not yet been given a reason to be afraid, with a rapid, practiced assessment that catalogued rank, gender, and race in moments, and arrived at a conclusion before it had examined all the evidence. He saw the chief insignia. He calculated incorrectly that this was manageable. "Commander," he said with the smooth professionalism of a man who has navigated difficult conversations before. "This is a health department matter. We have it under control." "Officer Harlow," Naomi said, "step away from the door." He did not move immediately. The pause was deliberate. A test. Small and deniable. The kind that operates below the threshold of insubordination, but communicates everything above it. It lasted several seconds. Naomi did not repeat herself. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has already decided what happens next and is simply waiting for him to catch up to that fact. Harlow stepped aside. Naomi walked past him into the bakery. She did not look at him as she passed. She went directly to her mother and, for a moment, brief, private, conducted with the economy of two people who know each other deeply enough not to require much. She placed one hand on Dorothy's shoulder. Dorothy covered it with her own hand. Then Naomi straightened and turned. She picked up the violation forms from the counter. She read each one in its entirety, during which no one spoke. The reporter stood in the doorway, camera operator beside him, red light blinking. Naomi took out her phone. She dialed the state health department's regional office. She identified herself by name and rank. She read the violation codes from each form. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the voice on the other end said carefully, "Chief, those codes were updated in a previous regulatory revision. They no longer apply to food service establishments of this size." "Thank you," Naomi said. "I'd appreciate that in writing. My email is on file with your office." She ended the call and turned to Inspector Finch. "Which regulation code," she said, "covers baking odor as a ventilation violation for a residential adjacent commercial space in a district zoned RC2? Finch opened his mouth. "Specific code," Naomi said. "Chapter, section, subsection, show me." Finch looked at Harlow. "Don't look at him," Naomi said. "Look at me." The room was very quiet. Reed by the wall had stopped pretending to look at the floor. He was watching Naomi with an expression that moved in real time from anxiety toward something that might have been distantly relief. The relief of a person who has been waiting for someone to say a thing out loud that everyone in the room already knew. Finch could not produce a code because there was no code. There had never been a code. Naomi set the violation forms on the counter in a neat stack. She took out her own notepad and wrote a single line. Then she looked at Harlow. "Badge and firearm," she said. "Set them on the counter." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. This one had weight. Harlow's jaw tightened. "Chief, you don't have the departmental authority to—" "I'm going to stop you there," Naomi said, and her voice was so calm it was almost kind, the way certain very steady things appear gentle until you test them. "Check your watch, officer. You might want to reconsider that sentence in a short while." No one in the room understood what that meant. Harlow's eyes moved to her face, searching for the angle, finding nothing readable. "This is a personnel matter between yourself and Chief Lang," he said, falling back on the scaffolding he trusted. "And I'll be taking this up with—" "You'll set your badge and firearm on the counter," Naomi said, "or I will have you escorted from this building by officers who outrank you. Those officers are currently nearby and will be here quickly if I call them. This is not a conversation, Harlow. It is a directive." Something in his face changed. Not submission, not yet, but the recognition that the ground had shifted in a way he had not anticipated and could not immediately explain. He set the badge on the counter, then the firearm, unholstered carefully beside it. Naomi looked at Finch. "You're done here." Finch gathered his clipboard and left without another word. Outside, the reporter lowered the phone he had been holding toward Naomi's voice, like a microphone, and looked at his camera operator. The camera operator nodded. They had everything. Dorothy watched her daughter from the stool behind the counter. She had not moved since Naomi arrived. Her hands were folded in her lap, still dusted faintly with flour, and her expression was something that could not be easily named, not pride exactly, though that was part of it. More like the feeling of seeing something you always believed was true, finally made visible to the rest of the world. Naomi's phone buzzed. City Hall. She looked at the screen, looked at the time. Not long until the ceremony. She answered. The voice on the other end was Deputy City Clerk Raymond Foster, who had been coordinating the ceremony for weeks and had the particular anxieties of a man for whom logistics were a moral issue. "Chief Designate Ellison, we have little time and the dais is set up. The council members are arriving. Mayor Howell is already in the building. And where are you? Where are you right now?" Oak Street, Naomi said. Corner of 5th. A pause. Oak Street, yes, the ceremony is at City Hall. I know where the ceremony is, Raymond. Another pause, longer. Should I? I need you to bring the ceremony here, Naomi said. To Oak Street, in front of Dot's Corner Bakery. Bring the mayor, bring the council, bring whoever is supposed to be there, bring the Bible. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that she could hear him breathing. Chief, the dais, the sound system is… We won't need a dais, she said. We won't need a sound system. Bring the Bible and bring the people. That's all. She ended the call. Harlow had heard enough to understand the shape of what was happening, though not yet its full dimensions. He stood near the counter where his badge and firearm sat, and his eyes moved between Naomi and the phone in her hand with the rapid calculation of a man trying to reassemble a picture from pieces that were not fitting together the way they should. What exactly? One ceremony is on Oak Street soon. Naomi looked at him. Wait and see. It took little time. First came 2 black sedans, then a city van, then Mayor Monica Harlan's town car, which pulled up to the curb with the mild confusion of a vehicle that has been redirected mid-route and is not entirely certain why. The mayor herself emerged looking pressed and pleasant in the way politicians do when they have not yet understood that something is wrong. Behind her came 3 city council members. Deputy Clerk Foster, carrying a leather-bound Bible and a folder of ceremony documents, with the expression of a man walking through a dream he cannot wake from. A photographer from the city communications office, and the reporter, who had stepped back to the sidewalk and positioned himself with the careful stillness of someone who understood he was witnessing something that would not happen twice. Beverly Okafor had not gone back inside her salon. She stood on the sidewalk with her arms folded, watching. The man from the auto shop had crossed the street. A woman from the laundromat at the end of the block appeared in her doorway. Word traveled the way it always travels on a street where people have lived alongside each other for years. Without announcement, through a quality of attention that passes from person to person, like a current. Mayor Harlan's eyes moved from the closure notice on the bakery door to Dorothy sitting visible through the window to Harlow standing inside without his badge, and her pleasant expression underwent a series of rapid adjustments before settling into something that was not quite any one emotion, but contained elements of several. Chief Ellison, she said carefully, this is an unusual venue. Yes, Naomi said. It is. She turned to Deputy Foster. Raymond, are you ready? Foster looked at his folder, looked at the sidewalk, looked at the small gathering of officials and neighbors and one camera operator standing on a public street in front of a bakery with a closure notice on the door. Yes, I'm ready. Good. Naomi walked into this bakery and stood in front of her mother. Dorothy looked up at her from the stool. She had not been told what was coming. Naomi had not called ahead, had not prepared her. But Dorothy Ellison had survived a war and raised a daughter and run a business for many years, and she was not a woman who needed to be prepared for things. She looked at her daughter's face and understood. She stood up from the stool. She took the Bible from Deputy Foster, who had followed Naomi inside. She held it with both hands the way she had held things that mattered, steady from beneath, bearing the weight without drawing attention to the effort. Naomi stood before her mother in the middle of Dot's Corner Bakery. Flour on the floor, broken ceramic near the display case, the closure notice visible through the front window behind them, and raised her right hand. Outside, the crowd had grown to perhaps 30 people. Nobody had announced anything. They had simply gathered the way people gather when they sense that something real is happening in a world that often offers them only performances. Deputy Foster read the oath. His voice was steadier than expected. Naomi repeated each line with her eyes on her mother's face. Her voice did not waver. When the final words were spoken, faithfully discharge the duties of the office upon which I am about to enter. Dorothy pressed the Bible upward slightly, the way you lift something precious. The people on the sidewalk applauded, not thunderously, genuinely. The sound of people who had not planned to applaud and were doing it anyway, because it would have been wrong not to. The reporter wrote in his notebook without looking down. Mayor Harlan clapped with everyone else and hoped her expression communicated the appropriate things, though she was no longer certain what the appropriate things were. Retiring Chief Victor Lang, who had followed the small caravan from City Hall, mostly out of confusion, and was now standing at the back of the sidewalk crowd with a piece of his own retirement cake still on a paper plate in his hand, looked at Harlow through the bakery window and felt for the first time in a long while something very close to afraid. Naomi lowered her hand. She looked at her mother for one more moment, long enough for something private to pass between them, the compressed communication of women who know each other at depth. Then she turned. Harlow was still standing near the counter. His badge was still beside him. His face had gone the particular color of a man who has just understood all at once the full dimension of his mistake. Naomi walked toward him slowly, and the room went very quiet. "Now," she said, "where were we?" The bakery had never been this full of people who were not there for the food. Council members stood near the window. The mayor occupied the space beside the register, with the careful stillness of a woman deciding in real time which version of herself to be. The reporter stood at the edge of the room, where the light from the doorway caught the notepad in his hand. And in the center of it all, Vance Harlow stood behind the counter, with no badge, no firearm, and no more room to maneuver. Naomi did not raise her voice. She had learned a long time ago that volume was what you used when authority was in question. Hers was not in question, not anymore. "Officer Harlow," she said, "I'm going to ask you some questions in front of these witnesses, and I want you to think carefully before you answer each one. Do you understand?" Harlow's jaw was tight. "I understand. When did you file the complaint that initiated this morning's inspection?" A pause. "Yesterday evening." "At what time?" "Around early evening." "And the closure notices you brought with you this morning, the pre-printed ones. When were those prepared?" Another pause. Longer. "The kind that answers the question before the words do." "I had them prepared in advance as standard." "You prepared closure notices for a business before the inspection that supposedly justified them had taken place." It was not a question. Harlow recognized that and said nothing. Lena Harper stepped forward from the wall. She had been standing there since Naomi arrived, notebook in hand, waiting for this moment with the patience of someone who had been rehearsing it for about a year, without knowing that was what she was doing. She set the notebook on the counter. "Chief, this is a contemporaneous record of events from this morning. Times, actions, specific statements. I can attest to its accuracy." Naomi looked at her. "Thank you, Officer Harper." Malcolm Reed, by the side wall, exhaled. Then he took several steps forward and stood beside Harper. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it was steady in the way that things are steady when they have finally stopped fighting their own weight. "I can confirm everything she wrote," he said. "All of it." Harlow turned to look at him. Reed did not look back. Naomi's phone was in her hand. She opened the file her liaison had sent, prepared quickly, because the liaison was very good at what he did, and read from it without preamble. "Multiple civilian complaints against Officer Vance Harlow filed in recent years. Several of those complaints were from black business owners on the Oak Street corridor. All were closed by Sergeant Harlan Reed within a short time of filing, without investigation, without documentation of resolution, and without notification to the complainants." She looked up from the screen. In the doorway, Sergeant Harlan Reed stood frozen. He had walked from the station to Oak Street because someone had called him, he was not sure who, now in retrospect, and told him Harlow needed support. He had arrived expecting to find a manageable situation. He had instead arrived at the precise moment his name was being read aloud in a room full of witnesses, a camera operator, and the new chief of police. His face did what faces do when the ground disappears beneath them. Mayor Harlan shifted. She turned slightly toward the door, an instinct more than a decision, and found that the angle of the reporter's camera had shifted with her. She turned back. "This is..." I want to be clear that the city's position is one of full cooperation with Mayor, Naomi said without looking at her. Not yet. Harlan closed her mouth. Harlow tried one final angle. He had been turning it over since Naomi arrived, testing its weight, and now he deployed it with the precision of a man playing his last card. "Chief Ellison," he said, and his voice carried a performance of reasonableness that almost disguised the desperation underneath. "I want to raise a formal concern about conflict of interest. The subject of this inspection is your mother. I think it's fair to ask whether you have the objectivity to—" "You're right," Naomi said. Harlow blinked. "Which is why, earlier this morning, I submitted a full report of this incident to the State Attorney General's office and requested that an independent investigative team be assigned." She looked at her phone screen and read the timestamp. "They confirmed receipt before I arrived on this street. There is no conflict of interest in my actions this morning because I had already removed myself from the investigative process before taking any action. What I am doing now is my job, responding to a scene where departmental misconduct was actively occurring." Harlow had no more cards. Reed, still in the doorway, took a slow step backward. Harper looked at him, just looked at him, steady and clear, and he stopped moving. Lang stood at the far edge of the sidewalk crowd, paper plate in hand, cake untouched. His face had gone the color of old chalk. He understood with the particular clarity of a man whose careful architecture is collapsing that his name was in those complaint files, that his signature was on those closure forms, that the retirement he had imagined, quiet, comfortable, unexamined, was no longer the retirement he was going to get. Inside the bakery, Dorothy sat on her stool and watched all of it with her hands folded and her back straight and her eyes moving occasionally to the photograph of Eleanor Price on the wall. "Eleanor," she thought, "you would have had something to say about all of this." She almost smiled. Almost. By that afternoon, several things had happened that Vance Harlow would spend the rest of his career thinking about. First, he and Sergeant Reed had been placed on administrative suspension, pending an independent investigation conducted by the State Attorney General's office. The suspension was effective immediately, which meant that by the time Harlow drove home from Oak Street, his access badge no longer worked on the department's rear entrance. He discovered this when he tried to return for his personal items and found the door unresponsive. He stood in the parking lot for a moment, key fob in hand, and then got back in his car. Second, Inspector Walter Finch had his inspector certification flagged for review by the State Licensing Board pending an inquiry into the validity of the citations he had issued that morning. The inquiry had been initiated by a single phone call from Naomi's office. Finch learned about it via email while eating lunch at his desk and believing the day had gone reasonably well. And third, retiring Chief Victor Lang, who had been scheduled to complete his final day of service, receive a plaque, and exit the Millhaven Police Department that evening with a pension and a handshake, was instead invited by the Attorney General's representative, who arrived that afternoon, to remain available for cooperation with the investigation into the handling of civilian complaints during his tenure. The word "invited" was used in the specific way it is used when the alternative is not preferable. Lang's retirement party had ended at midday. The plaque was still on his desk. He did not take it home that evening. Mayor Monica Harlan stood before a microphone outside City Hall later that afternoon and read a statement that her communications director had written, and she had approved without changing a word because she did not trust herself to find better ones. The statement expressed the city's commitment to transparency, its support for the independent investigation, and its confidence in the new chief's leadership. It did not use the words apology or wrong in any form, which the reporter noted in his article with the precision of a man who understands that what is omitted is often more informative than what is said. Naomi stood beside the mayor during the statement and said nothing. She did not need to. The camera had been on Oak Street that morning and the footage was already being edited. By evening it would be on the regional news, and by later it would be somewhere considerably larger than that. In a nearby city, in a rented apartment, a man named Calvin Oates watched the Oak Street footage on his phone. He had seen the notification in his news feed and had sat down on his couch and watched the whole thing several times before he could move. Calvin had owned a grocery on Oak Street for many years. He had loved that store the way people love things they have built with their own hands and their own money and their own stubborn refusal to give up. Years earlier, Harlow had come to him with the same proposition he had brought to Dorothy. The same language, the same smile, the same patience that was really a threat. Calvin had refused. Months later, the violations had arrived, and the inspections, and the slow, suffocating pressure that made each day more expensive and more exhausting until the math stopped working. He had sold and left Millhaven and told himself he was moving forward. He watched the footage again. He set his phone down on the cushion beside him and sat quietly for a long while. Then he picked it up and dialed a number he had not dialed in years. On Oak Street later that day, Naomi stood in front of her mother with a single piece of paper in her hand. The business license, creased once along the center where Harlow had folded it. She had retrieved it from the property inventory that Harper had compiled. Everything removed from the bakery that morning, cataloged, bagged, and documented within hours of the suspension order. She held it out to her mother. Dorothy took it with both hands. She looked at it for a moment. The paper was slightly soft from being in someone's pocket. She smoothed it flat against her palm carefully, the way you flatten something you intend to keep. "There's a new frame at the hardware store 2 blocks down," Naomi said. "I already called. They're holding one." Dorothy looked up at her daughter. "You called a hardware store?" "I called a hardware store." Dorothy made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something that required her to press her lips together briefly before she trusted herself to speak again. "All right," she said, "all right." Naomi turned to the front door. The closure notice was still on the glass, slightly bubbled at one corner, where the adhesive had not fully set. She peeled it from the bottom first, slow and even, the way you remove something you want to come off cleanly. It came away in one piece. She folded it once and handed it to Harper, who had not left. She turned back to her mother. "Open your doors, Mom." Dorothy walked to the front door of Dot's Corner Bakery, turned the deadbolt, and pushed it open. The smell came out before anything else. Warm sugar and cinnamon and browning butter. The residual warmth of an oven that had been running since early morning. It moved into the street air like an exhale. The people on the sidewalk. Beverly Okafor, the man from the auto shop. The woman from the laundromat. The neighbors who had stayed. The ones who had come back. Began to applaud, not in the organized way of ceremonies, but in the spontaneous way of people who had been holding something for a long time and were now releasing it. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the light had gone golden and the street was quietening toward evening, Naomi found her mother in the back kitchen. Dorothy was cleaning the prep table, methodical, unhurried, the motion of someone who has done this countless times and finds it steadying. Naomi leaned in the doorway. Dorothy did not turn around. "You did good today," she said. "We did good," Naomi said. Dorothy set down the cloth. She turned and looked at her daughter. Really looked, the way a mother looks when she is memorizing something. Then she reached up and placed her palm against Naomi's cheek just for a moment. "I raised you right here," she said softly. "In this kitchen, you know that." "I know," Naomi said. "I know. A few months is not a long time, but sometimes it is long enough." By the end of those months, Vance Harlow had been formally terminated from the Millhaven Police Department following the conclusion of the Attorney General's investigation, which found systematic abuse of authority, fabrication of code violations, and coordinated targeting of minority-owned businesses along the Oak Street corridor, spanning several years. He was facing counts of extortion, civil rights violations under federal statute, and a separate civil suit filed by several business owners, including Calvin Oates, who had driven back to Millhaven, from a nearby city specifically to add his name to the complaint. Harlan Reed was terminated the same period, facing charges related to obstruction of justice and deliberate suppression of civilian complaints. The numerous closure orders he had signed over the years were being reviewed individually, each one reopened and re-examined by an independent auditor appointed by the AG's office. Walter Finch lost his certification. The hearing took little time. Victor Lang did not receive his pension on schedule. His case was still under review, the particular legal purgatory of a man who had spent decades building careful walls and was now watching them taken apart brick by brick with great thoroughness. Mayor Monica Harlan completed her term. She did not announce a re-election campaign. Malcolm Reed cooperated fully with the investigation. He gave a recorded statement that ran many pages and contained details what no one else could have provided about the internal operations of the system. In exchange, he kept his badge. He was required to complete a full ethics retraining program, many weeks mandatory, and was reassigned to a different district under close supervision. He completed the program without complaint. On the last day, he wrote a letter to Dorothy Ellison. He did not mail it for 2 weeks. Then he did. Dorothy read it at the bakery counter on a Wednesday morning between the first and second baking rounds. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the drawer beneath the register, in the same place she kept Eleanor's last letter from, years ago. Officer Lena Harper was promoted to captain in the 2nd month. She was young, which made her one of the youngest captains in the history of the Millhaven Police Department. At her promotion ceremony, held at her request informally in the department break room, with folding chairs and coffee from a diner 2 blocks away, Naomi pinned the rank to her collar and said quietly, so only Harper could hear, "You did this on the first day. Everything else was just catching up." Harper looked at the wall for a moment to compose herself. Then she said, "Yes, Chief." The Civilian Oversight Board was established in the 2nd month. It had several seats. Dorothy was elected to the first one by a community vote that was not close. She attended meetings in her apron if they were scheduled during bakery hours, which she did not apologize for. She asked questions at every meeting, specific and detailed, and she did not accept answers that were not specific and detailed in return. Other board members began doing the same thing gradually, through a kind of osmosis that occurs when someone in the room makes it clear that vague answers are not sufficient. Calvin Oates came back to Millhaven in the 3rd month. He had been offered a settlement as part of the civil proceedings, enough to start over. He signed a lease on a storefront 2 doors down from Dot's Corner Bakery, the space that had been a vacant dry cleaner for years, and began the slow, specific work of rebuilding something he had already built once before. He stopped by the bakery on the day he signed the lease. Dorothy was behind the counter. She saw him come in, and she came around from behind the counter, and they stood in the middle of the room and held each other for a moment without saying anything. The way people hold each other when they have both carried something too heavy for too long. "You're back," Dorothy said. "I'm back," Calvin said. Naomi implemented the reforms over the months with the same methodical consistency she had applied to everything else. Body cameras mandatory, complaint reporting system, public-facing and searchable. Every complaint assigned a tracking number provided to the complainant. Response timelines posted regularly. The first quarterly report was published at the end of the 3rd month. It was several pages long and written in plain language. Naomi had written the plain language requirement into the policy personally. On the day the new bakery sign went up, Dot's Corner Bakery, gold letters on a dark green background, replacing the old painted letters that had been fading for years. A small crowd gathered on Oak Street. It was not an organized event. There had been no announcement. People simply came the way they had come on the day Naomi took the oath on the sidewalk, because something real was happening, and they wanted to be present for it. Veterans came. Several of the men and women who had served in different years and different places, who had driven from different parts of the county, because the story had traveled, and they had recognized something in it. They stood near the door in civilian clothes. And when Dorothy came outside and saw them, she stopped walking and stood very still for a moment. Then she walked to them and shook each hand. Naomi stood beside her mother as the sign went up. She was not in uniform. She wore a plain jacket and her hair down. And she looked in this light less like a chief of police and more like a daughter who had driven home to be somewhere important. Dorothy looked up at the sign. Then she looked down at her hands. The hands that had held the IV lines of dying men, that had kneaded many years of dough, that had held the Bible, while her daughter swore an oath on a sidewalk covered in broken ceramic. She looked up at the photograph visible through the window. Eleanor Price, smiling with no idea what was coming. Or perhaps Dorothy had thought this more than once with every idea, and smiling anyway. Eleanor would have loved this, Dorothy said. Naomi looked at the photograph. She would have eaten half the pies before the sign was up. Dorothy laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind that surprises the person having it. She opened the door. The smell came out again. Warm sugar, cinnamon, browning butter. The particular comfort of something made from scratch by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and it moved into the street, and the people on the sidewalk breathed it in, and the morning continued. Inside the bakery, on the wall beside the register, in a new frame with a small crack in the glass that Dorothy had decided to keep, hung the original business license. And beside it, matted and sealed behind museum glass that Naomi had ordered specifically, the closure notice. Red letters on white paper, temporarily closed. Dorothy had been the one who decided to frame it. Why? Naomi had asked. Because, Dorothy had said, pressing the backing into place with the heel of her hand. I want to remember what they thought was the end of something. Dignity is not something that can be taken from a counter or folded into a pocket. Dorothy Ellison did not win because her daughter wore a badge. She won because she never stopped standing straight, in a war, in a kitchen, in the middle of her own broken bakery floor. The badge only made visible what was already true. Courage doesn't wait for backup. It just holds its ground until justice catches up. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what this meant to you. And if you believe these stories deserve to be heard, subscribe. There are more people like Dorothy out there. They deserve to be seen.